Hi there and welcome to the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuru. Now, the Finance Minister has presented his 2020 budget statement economic policy to the people of Ghana on the floor of Parliament. We've gone through some of the numbers already on the Joy News platform. Tonight, on the business edition of PM Express, we want to delve into specifics. Particularly, we'll look at the priority areas, 9 of them that the Finance Minister listed when he started reading the budget speech. We'll look at 2 of them. If there's time, we'll look at a third and see what's in there for us, for businesses particularly, and for the consuming community, that's you and I, the consumers. We'll also look at the financial sector statements that were made. The Finance Minister says the banking sector assets, I beg your pardon, have moved up from about 89 billion in 2017 to about 115 billion in 2019. And profitability in the banking sector has increased, but some disagree and say that this profitability is coming from only the investments in securities. We need to subject that to some analysis. And we'll also look at what my guests feel should or should not be in there in this 2020 budget on the theme consolidating for growth, jobs and prosperity for all. Consolidating the gains for growth, jobs, prosperity for all. So this is the business edition of PM Express. When we come back, I'll introduce my guests and we'll set the ball rolling. Right, welcome back from the break. So we are going to jump into our stuff first and foremost. I want to introduce my guest. I have a new friend on set today. His name, Anthony Sapon, senior partner at KPMG, auditing and accounting firm, right here in Accra. That's him. And our regular friend here, Seth Chumakwaba, CEO of the Association of Ghana Industries, AGI. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So before we get into the hard stuff of this discussion, I want us to look at, first and foremost, I'll start with Seth, your general impressions or views about this 2020 budget presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to your viewers. I think generally speaking, you could tell that the government objective of consolidating the gains we've made in the macroeconomic environment is really in force here. You could tell that the government doesn't want to disturb the regime in terms of taxes and a lot of the business environment issues. If you remember, in 2018, we had, even in the midterm review, we had lots of new different taxes being introduced. So there was a whole lot of changes, and that was disturbing the system a little bit. But this time around, you could see that government is maintaining most of the things that are already in the budget or in the system. At the macroeconomic level, you could also see that there's an effort to consolidate whatever gains we've made. I think if you track the trend, we are having good stability in the macroeconomic environment. CD depreciation has been within reasonable range. Early part of the year, we had some challenges, but subsequently it's been quite stable. Inflation has been dropping, policy rate has been coming down. So at the macro level, there's been a lot of improvement. Of course, businesses are always complaining about the fact that even when policy levels are coming down, interest rates
don't come down.
So that's an issue. But in the projections into the next year, which is 2020, you could see that all these indicators are being kept within reasonable range. So I could see an effort to consolidate the gains we've made. And for businesses, this is important because if you're able to have a predictable business environment, then you can also plan ahead and do bigger business, borrow the funds you need and expand your operations. So it's very critical. And I think on the whole, that is what I see about this budget. Not too many introductions in terms of the tax regime, but of course there have been some few additions and introductions in the policy arena that I believe is also supposed to support businesses. Okay. So that's my general impression about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Sapon, would you also agree that we've consolidated the gains or even the government has touted since it came to power? This year's budget looks like one that consolidates gains.
Yeah. Thank you very much. As you know, one of the functions of government, it's really to come out with broad policy framework that can guide individuals, households, and businesses in undertaking the activities that they want to do in a year. So when you take the national budget, for me or for us as people who do business in the economy, it's one of the means that government can signal the policy directions where it has to
Sure.
go. So as said, if you look at the 4 key themes underlying the budget, you could see some level of consolidation, and the themes are the macro stability indicators, the fiscal policy, somehow the monetary policy, and also the signal that government gives in terms of how it's going to get involved in the real productive sector.
Yeah.
So if you talk about the macroeconomic environment, as rightly said, you will see that over the past few years, and also looking into the medium term, in the 2020 budget, government relates back to 2019, 2018, the stability it has achieved, and also looks at the medium term, what you want to achieve, and places the positions, what you have there. So one of the critical things that comes out of this budget, and particularly the minister also mentioned, is the deficit that we need to watch.
Okay.
For the first time, as the minister mentioned during the budget reading, we have the fiscal stability law.
Yeah.
So in the past, through moral suasion and our own responsibility, we will decide that we will not exceed certain threshold. But today, we have the law which says you cannot exceed 5%. So within that context, it is important that this budget reflects that. And for 2019 outturn, as you see in the budget, it's recording about 4.5, and the minister says looking at budget deficit of not exceeding 4.7.
Yeah.
So that tells you that it's not just the moral situation, but we are signaling a purpose to stay within what the law also says. Inflation is also being pegged to about 8%, currently at 7%. So if you look at these variables, it just tells you that we don't want to move from what we are currently pursuing. And what it does to business is that it gives the certainty, for some level of certainty for businesses to plan,
True.
to forecast, and to be able to focus on that. Then in the area of the fiscal level, not much new tax introductions have been made. So the government says, I'm going to consolidate the taxes that are there, and also look at the efficiency and effectiveness with which GRA, which is the state body mandated to collect taxes, can be efficient,
yeah.
and look at those ones. And then, of course, I think critical that will partner the fiscal policy is the monetary policy regime by the central bank. You could also see from the reserve buildup that today we are talking about 4.5 months cover. So that tells you that they've taken a policy direction that will build up reserves.
Yeah.
And in this budget, we are told that government is targeting at 3.5. So that is also consistent with what we are seeing from the past, and that consolidates that. And then, of course, over the last 2 years, you see the policy rate also coming down in some way to address the inflation targeting policy that the central bank also
has put in place.
So both from the fiscal policy and from monetary policy, one could see that there's some consolidation as well as a positioning that says that we do not have to deviate from what will give the economy
what we've
a good
gained
balance
over the cost.
But as we go along, I think fundamentally, to achieve these things, one also has to mention that it's very important that government still stays focused in terms of managing the entire budget, revenue and expenditure.
Particularly as we enter
into election year.
Yeah.
And what is good is that we've just come out of IMF program, where certain disciplines, where certain responsibilities were taken. I believe that if we impose it upon ourselves to continue in those disciplines and stay within those benchmarks, then we will be able to maintain these targets that have been signaled in the budget and then create the environment for businesses to flourish and thrive.
Okay. At the beginning of your submissions, you mentioned government provides a broad scope. You used the word broad. And in the budget speech, the Minister of Finance mentioned some key priority areas. I have an infograph of the 9 key priority areas, just a snapshot to tell us what exactly or which areas they'll be concentrating on. I'm sure it will be displayed very shortly for you to have a look at it. Priority areas of the government. The first one has to look at domestic revenue mobilization. That's the first one. Then I think there was one also on the issue of business regulatory reforms. What you see in front of you is the financial services, which we will get into during the conversation. But what we are talking about right now is the priority areas. And the first one is domestic revenue mobilization. Second one is business regulatory reforms. Third one, intensified drive for FDI. That one I was particularly happy about. Fourth one, enhanced financial support to local enterprises. I'll come to Seth on that. Fifth one, International Financial Services Center. Yes, so you can see it displayed right in front of you. I'll take them again from the top. 1, domestic revenue mobilization. 2, business regulatory reforms. 3, intensified drive for foreign direct investment, that's FDI. 4, enhanced financial support to local enterprises. 5, International Financial Services Center. 6, digitization. 7, accelerated infrastructure development. 8, science and technology. And 9, the private sector. Seth and Anthony, I'll start with Seth on this. And I would want to play to your most important area, enhanced support to local enterprises. And in the mix of all these priority areas, when I look at the enhanced support to local enterprises, and it says government will deploy early in 2020 a number of initiatives to enhance the access of our business to finance, including medium and long-term capital. These new include the National Development Bank, which you and I have discussed on this show sometime before, the Ghana Incentives-Based Risk-Sharing System for Agricultural Lending, GESL, the Ghana Commodity Exchange, and fortunately last week I was privileged to host the CEO of the Ghana Commodity Exchange here, and a strengthened venture capital trust fund. When you look in there, Seth, do you get a sense, do you get a feeling that this will go particularly looking at industry and how this government touted its drive for industrial development? Looking at some of these interventions, let's say the National Development Bank and GESL, will give the right cushion to your category of industries?
Well, I think generally speaking, the areas mentioned are important and they sound interesting. But as we always say, the sweetness of the pudding is in the eating. It's about how we are able to implement some of these lofty ideas and how we are able to quickly do that to ensure that finance is advanced to the business sector. I remember last year's budget, there was a similar provisions. For example, there was the talk about coming up with a development bank. It came in last year's budget, but we didn't do much. We didn't go very far. So today it's being repeated, which is very good. But I think it's a massive thing if we're able to do it, because we always talk about how businesses can get access to medium to long-term funding. Yeah. If you look at some of the government initiatives that they've come up with, the One District, One Factory, the stimulus package, the industrial zones and all that, these are all major initiatives to support industrial development. And the key area of challenge that the businesses have faced so far is access to medium to long-term capital. It's been a big challenge, especially in the wake of the financial reforms and all that. There's been some credit squeeze to the business sector. And therefore, it is important that government is making it a key part of the agenda for 2020. And the areas he's mentioned are very important. He's talking about NIB, for example, being supported, ADB. These are critical financial institutions for development. NIB for industrial development, ADB for agricultural development. The entire chain must work. And then they are coming up with a development bank. And indeed, the essence of having a development bank is to be able to give a different kind of funding, not the typical commercial lending, which is short-term in nature, very short moratorium, with very high interest rates and all that. So if you're able to have effective development bank, it means that it's going to intervene in the area of long-term funding. And if you want to do One District, One Factory, it is so critical that you have a kind of financing arrangement that supports it. Bear in mind that if you take the One District, One Factory, for example, most of them are startups because the industries are not already existing in the district. That's why we say One District, One Factory. So they are basically new industries that are going to be set up. Meanwhile, when you go to the normal commercial banks, they are going to be asking for, your 3-year or so,
3 to 5 years,
3 to 5 years financial records and all that. And you don't have that. And therefore, you need a kind of financing mechanism that is project-oriented, that is able to take a bit of risk, and look more into the future instead of the past. So, and you need a development bank to do that. So doing so will help a great deal. Venture capital, very important, because if you are only financing your activities with loans, already it's going to be difficult, because most times you must also come up with a certain minimum capital to not to be highly geared, and therefore you need venture capital. The challenge has been that the venture capital has been with us for so many years. It's not new to us, and that's why I said the sweetness of the pudding is in the eating. So when we say we are going to improve or enhance venture capital, we need to look at the numbers. How much money are we going to put into the venture capital trust fund? We have it already. How much more are we going to mop up into it? How are we going to administer it? If the venture capitalists operate like the normal banks, then where are we going? We are not getting much value. So again, if we're able to do it and do it well, venture capital is going to be a great thing, because equity-based financing is critical. Agricultural lending, very important. You know, part of the reason why the 1D1F, people think that it hasn't gone as fast as we expected, it's all because of the agri-value chain that hasn't worked that well. You know, I know there's a lot of effort going there now, but if you get agri-value chain working very well, then they can supply the needed raw materials to the industry to produce. So you need to have agricultural lending in a proper manner that people can do large-scale agriculture, so that you have consistent and reliable supply of raw materials. So these are all very important, and as I said, it all depends on how
we execute.
We execute it. There are other areas of, you know, financial support for enterprises that was mentioned. At the micro level, they talked about Maslow, the fact that the recovery rate has increased from 22% to about 55%. It's a significant improvement. ADR, we are even trying to come in here to see how we can help our small enterprises, the micro enterprise, to access some of these funds. If you're able to have good recovery rates at the on the Maslow loans, it's going to be very good and game changer. So we need that. And then I also understand the MBSSI level, the kind of enterprise mechanism and support that government is trying to put in place. If you're able to work on all this very well, I'm sure we'll have a significant improvement in providing enterprise support for enterprises to grow.
Okay, on the issue of the National Development Bank, I think the finance minister told us, and it's important to say that he said the World Bank was providing, or they have secured some 250 million from the World Bank, and other development institutions such as the AFDB have expressed interest. Like again, he said, it's all about the execution, because I think we've tried development banking somewhere in the 70s, and credit rationing, interest rate ceilings, it didn't work. We had repression. We came out, had liberalization, and then we had to rebuild the financial sector again. So back again, all about the execution and then the political will to ensure that we do what is right.
But you know, the good part of this is the fact that we're getting external funding to do it. We are not going to tax the people to do it. So it means that it's an additional capital that's going to be injected into the economy. And for me, that's the good part of it.
That's a good part of it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, if I may add on to what Seth has mentioned, if you look at this country, until recently, when we introduced the pensions, savings habit was very low. So in terms of building individual and household savings, that will enable people to undertake their ventures was virtually non-existent. So what individuals rely on is somehow credit to be able to finance some entrepreneurship projects. And as you know, if the credits are very high, then ab initio, you are setting yourself to fail. So I believe that this concept of the development bank is one of the things that government should put all its efforts in to make sure it succeeds. Because one, development bank by their nature will have to be specialized, targeted at offering credit to solve particular problems in our development agenda. And if we take that into account, then that will mean that, as Seth rightly said, instead of businesses running to commercial banks where they are giving credits at unsustainable rates, development banks will first of all tie to the life cycle of the project and make sure that if you need a long-term project, you get long-term financing and you don't have a mismatch between long-term project and short-term finances that sometimes we see. But here, you rightly said that we've tried this before. In also across the world, other places have tried it. And the critical thing is the factors that one needs to put in place to make sure that they succeed. And one of them is to ensure that if you have a development plan that is run by partly state or partly private, one of the key things is governance issues. You have to, right from the beginning, ensure that the governance structures that you put in these institutions are work. Second, you also need to make sure that it is well capitalized. If it is well capitalized, then at the end of the day, you're going to make sure that it can function the way it has to do. And thirdly, what we call banking conduct. Now, banking conduct means that there are certain aspects of banking operations that you need to follow certain principles. If you follow them, you survive. If you don't follow them, you won't. So areas like your risk appetite and your risk policies, what are they? What limits will you have to give? Core people that will be in management, do they have the experience and expertise to be able to run the institutions? The culture of the people that will be in these institutions are going to be fundamental.
Yeah.
So as we talk about forming development bank, I believe that one of the things that we must focus on is execution, ruthless execution, such that all these parameters or factors that will make a development bank succeed ab initio, we take them seriously and implement them. And if you do that, we'll get the long-term funding to be able to support
the necessary funding we need.
Yeah.
We've set this right for me. External funding. In here, over a period of time, we've had challenges with revenue mobilization. And then I'm coming to you, Anthony. And on domestic revenue mobilization, the finance minister says, we will take radical policy and institutional reforms towards raising our tax to GDP ratio over the medium term from under 13% currently to around 20%. The focus will be on efficiency and base broadening rather than imposing new taxes on our people and businesses. This way, we can raise our domestic contribution to our ambitious transformation agenda in line with the Ghana Beyond Aid vision. In there also, the finance minister mentions that GRA is going to be revamped. He mentions people, technology, and service. For me, it sounded like a commercial bank tagline, but in there, I see an effort on our government to want to do things. But I ask a question that's, so all along, what has been happening with GRA? And from where you sit, private sector player, with oversights in terms of auditing and accounting for institutions, what do you make of our domestic revenue mobilization drive?
Okay. Thank you, Philip. Revenue as a component of management of our budget is very critical. And if you look at Ghana, the situation of Ghana is one of the challenges we have and always create vulnerabilities for us. In a sense that if you are not able to raise sufficient domestic revenue, where do we turn to? You go to grant or aid, which we know that since we entered into the middle income bracket, it has dwindled. So what we then tend to do is to add on external borrowings. Whether domestic or external borrowing, what it does is that particularly for the external borrowing, you have both the twin effect of interest and exchange impacting you. So at the end of the day, for insufficient domestic revenue, you bring onto yourself additional challenges that disturbs the economy, that disturbs the macro stability that businesses need to survive. And therefore, talking about domestic revenue is one of the key things that I'm happy that this budget, the minister has signaled that they are going to work on. And if you look at where they are going to work on, they are saying that I'm not going to create new taxes, but let me look at the efficiency and effectiveness with which we can even mobilize from what we have. And one of the critical things is mentioned is introduction of technology. GRA for some time has been implementing some form of technology to assist in the mobilization of revenue. But at the end of the day, I think there's still some way to go. And these are some of the areas that I believe, based on what has been done so far to date, they can enhance it. And I'll give some good examples. In the area of withholding tax, we have implemented withholding tax for a long time. So for instance, if KPMG provides a service to an institution and the service is paying KPMG, depending upon the types of service, that entity will withhold 5% or 7.5%, depending upon the type of service. So that 5% will be paid by that institution and hand over to GRA, quoting that KPMG provided service A to me and I've paid this tax. If we have technology that will be able to trace all withholding taxes that various businesses have deducted from the service provider, at the end of the day, GRA will be able to determine and say, at a minimum, at least once withholding tax has been deducted, at a minimum, this is your income. Because one of the things we struggle with in this country is identify the accurate and complete income of people. And that can only be done if we use technology to stay ahead of the curve. The second example is also in the area of registration for tax identification number. The last 2 years, it's part of the requirement if you want to register a business at a Registrar General's department. But once it is done, trust me, without technology, you will not be able to find the people. And in tax administration, identifying the person or the taxpayer first, even before you determine the income, is very, very critical. So you have a situation where, for example, in Ghana, people will pay their SNIT, particularly the informal sector, because we've been talking about how do we bring the informal sector in. So for some informal sector people, they pay their contribution to SNIT. However, they will not pay their tax. So if you're able to use technology to identify them through the TIN registration and connect to SNIT, you'll be able to interface the two data and say, yes, you have registered for TIN, but 12 months down the line, I've not seen any returns coming through. But I can see you making returns through your Social Security. And based on that, again, you'll be able to identify them, you'll be able to have some assessment of income and be able to bring them onto the tax net. The third one that I want to cite is what we call building what we call the import or production chain ladder model. So typically in Ghana, the importers will bring the goods. They themselves will not be the people who are selling directly to the final consumer. Below them, there will be a chain of other wholesalers. Below that wholesalers, there will be a chain of retailers. We normally will capture maybe the base importer because at the port we have some data and maybe the first level wholesaler. But below it to the final distribution line, we don't. And therefore, again, one of the means to capture these people is to say, you build the technology. In year one, focus on identification. Every goods coming through the port, follow through the chain to the institutions that finally deliver it to the final consumer. Once you've done that, you've captured the value chain that is coming through. Each of these institutions, GRA can then be ahead of the curve and go to them and say, well, we know what is coming in. In this industry, these are the margins that we know are put on these goods. So we expect that with this inventory or inventory you have, this is your estimated turnover. This is the margin of cost or profit in this business you're doing. So we can estimate your profit and gradually bring them into the tax net. And finally, I think it's very relevant, is the rise of online businesses. Today, you have a lot of people who are providing deco services. And trust me, some are charging for some deco services 20,000 Ghana cedis per service, some even more. So if you assume that this person has 2 engagements or 3 engagements in a month, that's 60,000. Multiply by 12 months, you are talking about 700. Very few Ghanaians do earn such income in Ghana. But these people are operating on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, but they've not been captured on the net. You will need technology like what we call data and analytics to run through these online services, interface with GRA, to gradually identify these people and bring them onto the tax net. So I quite agree with the minister who says that they are going to invest in technology. I think we should do that and prioritize that. If you give ourselves 2 to 3 years and say we'll invest in technology, first to focus on identification, second to focus on determining the accessible income of the people we'll bring in, then from there going, we'll be able to be in a position to tax them. And I believe that these are some of the innovative ways that we should be able to expand and deepen our domestic tax mobilization.
Seth, I want you to hold on to your points for me. I saw you writing a lot as Anthony was giving his submissions. We'll take a quick break. This is the business edition of PM Express. My guest, Anthony Sapon, is a senior partner at KPMG, and Setchuma Kwabwa, CEO of AGI. We'll be right back. You're still live on the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuri, and my guest, Anthony Sapon, senior partner at KPMG, and Setchuma Kwabwa, CEO of AGI. Before we went on the break, Mr. Sapon was taking us through some very interesting proposals for broadening our tax base. And I think so far, in this whole week, in terms of the narratives of broadening tax base, I think that's the best I've heard so far. Maybe I'm being biased, but let's just leave it as it is. But during his submissions, Mr. Chuma Kwabwa was making some points, and he wants to share that with us.
Oh, I think basically I said a lot of the suggestions he's made, but when it talks of mobilizing revenue, it's not only taxes, it's also fees and charges and all that.
Okay.
The essence of this whole thing is how do you block the leakages in the system? There are so many leakages in the system, at the ports, at the registration, business registration, you know, even passport, everywhere we are actually having some leakages, and we need to be able to block it. And I think the introduction of the digitized system of managing these things are very important. I think the digitized regime would help a great deal, and we really need to work on that. Spreading the tax net, the suggestions are well articulated, and I think there's a lot more we can do. The challenge we've had in the past has been that well-established businesses, the formal sector is always burdened with the additional taxes and all that. So if you are spreading it to the informal sector, I think that would be, because the informal sector is very big in Ghana. So how do you ensure that the informal sector is brought into the tax net in a very big way? But in all this, we should also look at the exemption regimes. Sometimes it can also have a very negative effect in terms of our fund mobilization.
Yeah.
And it even has an effect on business development or industrial development, because people get exemptions, and for that reason, they get their goods into the country at a much cheaper cost and become more competitive than others. So all those have to be looked at. But anytime you're talking about fund mobilization and tax and all that, we must also look at the efficiency of your expenditure. I think it's a critical part of the equation. You can't only look at one side of the equation. The expenditure bit is very important. How do you ensure that we use proper procurement systems in all our public institutions to ensure that we have value for money in our procurement, so that the little we mobilize, we're able to efficiently deploy it to the areas that is most needed. I think it's very critical.
And I think the point you make about the non-tax revenue is also critically important, because we've been looking at how state-owned enterprises can run efficiently, so that they move from loss-making to profit-making entities, pay their taxes, and also give dividends to government also. I want us to talk a bit about banking. And the finance minister, since I've started observing since 2017, let me just say, he's very passionate and keen about the banking sector, perhaps because of his financial background. But in this budget speech, he says, and I want to just read it from there, and he says, Mr. Speaker, at the start of the reforms in August 2017, total assets were 89.1 billion for a sector that had 36 banks, and 2 years after the reform process started, total assets have increased to 115.2 billion at the end of August 2019, with only 23 banks now. In the same direction, total deposits have improved from 55.7 billion to 76 billion over the same comparative period, reflecting a stronger deposit base, owing to more trust and confidence in the banking sector, with fewer but stronger banks. Let me start with Mr. Sarpong here. You look at it and you realize that in terms of the numbers, the finance minister is very right. If you go and juxtapose that to Bank of Ghana's banking sector report, the most recent one, very right. But if you look in the report, you'd realize that the growth in assets are coming primarily from the bank's investments in securities rather than lending to businesses, or they are generating more from investments in securities rather than they are getting from lending now, obviously because of the risk associated with lending. In such submissions, is that a good claim to say that, is that a good point to use to say that the banking sector has now regained confidence?
Okay. Thank you very much. The banking sector is one of the critical sectors in every economy, because everything that happens in the business environment also revolves around banking, because they facilitate what we call the intermediation between one business to business, or an individual to businesses. And then, of course, in the case of Ghana, coming from the last 2 years where we've had the banking reforms taking place, typically that in itself will affect the banking sector. But nonetheless, I think it's important to go back to the Bank of Ghana report that you reference, which is the banking sector report for September 2019.
Yes.
And in that report on page 6, it does provide some portfolio analysis of the banking sector one. So just to look at in terms of what you just said. So if you look at in every bank, what we call in accounting terms the balance sheet, there are what we call the key earning assets. So securities, as you mentioned, and then you have the asset base. Then of course you look at what we call the funding areas, which is the liability side and also the capital side. But before I come to the asset side, I think it's important to step back, to go back to the funding side and to say that, okay, what really the source of assets that banks have, where do they come from? So if you look at that report, you will notice that the two sources of funding is capital and deposits.
Yeah.
With the capital, we are aware that the Bank of Ghana introduced the minimum capital requirement of 400. So that in itself, you see that the capital levels has jumped close to over 39.5% coming from that. But you also see, which interestingly for the same period, is that the deposits have also increased by about 12.2%. So that tells you that besides the capital, there has been some mobilization, funding coming to the banking sector. For people to bring their funds into the banking sector, what it tells you is that there's some confidence, there's some trust.
Okay.
If there's no trust, then it will not come. So that is the base foundation from which depositors will bring their money. And they believe that when they bring their deposits, anytime they need it, they will have access to it.
Access to it, very important.
So if you look at these two funding gaps, then one has to ask, how has the banking sector used these funding sources? You will then notice that largely in that report, it's being driven by investments, which is treasury bills and other securities, and then the loans. So interestingly, you mentioned that most of it are in securities. This report doesn't tell us that.
Okay.
In the securities, which is the total investment, is grown in 2019 by 13%. The loan side grown by 15%. So it tells you that the banks have put more in loans than in securities. More interestingly is what we call the net loans. So in the normal loans, which is the gross, it contains even your non-performing. And your non-performing, it means that the loan is the loan holder or the borrower cannot pay the interest. So in appearance, the loan will appear going up, but yet it's not fundamentally sustained by any substance of repayment. So when you look at it from net basis, which reflects the quality of the good loans in that portfolio, that grew by 18.7%. So if you just oppose the funding sources and then the portfolio allocation between securities and the loans, one would say that indeed the banks are focusing on two of their primary functions of asset portfolio, which is loans and securities. And it's clear that from both gross loans and from net loans, they are doing more than in the securities. And therefore, one can say that there's some level of correlation that after the post reforms, the banking sector is picking up and the trust is coming and the growth is coming by.
So, Seth, from Anthony's submissions, there is indeed some pickup, but I know industry always, more often than not, doesn't really feel that impact. Would you see that this pickup in terms of banks having a stronger capital base will afford them an opportunity to dip their hands into the bucket of industry where they have shied away from for obvious reasons?
Well, it is not that simple and it's not that straightforward. I think that, well, the claim that confidence is back, we have to look at it. I think it's early days yet. Mm-hmm. Definitely, the reforms definitely are going to help. I mean, industry has been crying over a high interest rate all these years. And we've noticed that in the banking sector, what was happening, there was no way interest rate was going to come down if there was no any such reform taking place. So the reforms were welcomed, except that the manner in which it was done, there was some panic in the system. It sent some shocks into the system. So confidence level was really down. It will take a little while before confidence will fully
pick up again.
But I think the signs are good, and we have to monitor to see what is happening. But the question of whether the increase in deposits and the funds and even the capitalization is going to lead to increase in loans to businesses. We have to monitor that as well. And also, what kind of loans are we talking about?
Yeah.
If it is still the very short-term facilities we are giving, it is not really development. If you look at most of our markets today, there's a lot of imports, there's a lot of trading going on, but actual production is weak. It's all because we are not giving the productive sector the kind of funding that we need. So if you have increased capitalization, and the capitalization is still funding trading, buy and sell, people are importing all kinds of goods, flooding the market, and then you're not getting medium to long-term capital at a cheaper cost for industries to produce, then you have a challenge. So we need to monitor to see the real impact in the coming years. But the fact that the capital base has gone up is good. It's not sufficient. It's good, but it's not sufficient to really turn around the industrial sector. We really need to monitor and ensure that we push the loans to the areas that is mostly needed.
Someone will argue that the nature of funding or the nature of deposits in this country is mainly short-term. So it wouldn't augur well for a bank to take short-term deposits and put it into long-term activity. So the challenge now becomes how are the banks going to diversify into longer-term sources of funding for their books at a cheaper cost for them. Because I see some banks taking facilities from other places to try and invest. But even I'm sure, and maybe I may be wrong, I'm sure even when they come, they look for areas where they want to minimize their risk and then make some substantive returns so that they don't put these funds at risk.
But you see, that is the essence of capitalization. The essence of recapitalizing means that you are bringing in long-term funding. If you have a capital increment in your business, it means that you only earn, the return on it is the profit. It's not the immediate return in terms of short-term basis. So if you are recapitalizing and the capitalization is real, it's actual injection of capital into the system, then what are you going to do with the money? You should be able to learn long-term. So we want to reduce risk, but risk has its own implication. If you want to reduce risk and you won't do any business, you can't get any return. And therefore, you should have a portfolio which is diversified. Some going for short-term facilities, but others also going for medium to long-term capitalization or to support businesses.
Okay.
So you need to really look at the portfolios very well, and the capitalization should help in providing medium to long-term funding. Otherwise, we are not supporting.
We're not growing ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just add to what you just said. That it is true that when you have the capital, you need to go into long term. But what we have to always remember is that for commercial banks, one of their primary focus is to maximize value and profit for their shareholders.
Yes.
And therefore, given the choice between a long term and a short term, they will go for what is profitable, what can also bring quick liquidity back and then they refinance. And that's why in the context of Ghana, I think it's important that this idea of development bank is so critical, because you realize that in our space, the commercial banks have a choice, and most likely they will not provide the long-term or development funding that you need to propel the productive sector. Even if you take a case of NIB, ADB, that we ourselves set up to focus on specific areas, you find out that in order to sustain and to survive, they veer into other areas which is probably more profitable to be able to survive. And therefore, on the commercial bank themselves will not solve that problem. And therefore, I think it's critical in that discussion where the minister has signaled that we need to have a development bank. I think we should bring that in so that where the gaps are between the commercial banks and between the other productive sectors. For example, we at KPMG believe that that's one of the necessary foundations that will help support this country to address the productive sector challenges.
Okay. We're taking a quick break. When we get back, we'll look at interest rates. We've discussed this over and over again. Let's see what my guests say, and then we'll have their wrap-up comments on the budget 2020. We'll be right back. Right. Welcome back from the break. This is the business edition of PM Express. We're in our last leg of the conversation. We've looked at the broad strokes in terms of the priority areas under the 2020 budget. We've looked at expenditure, looked at revenue. These are some of the key talking points. I want us to move into credit or lending or interest rates and see what the minister had to say about this with regards to a scheme they want to put in place. And I'll just read a bit of it. And he says, establishment of Enterprise Credit Scheme, ECS. Mr. Speaker, we would like to emphasize that the ultimate solution to the job creation lies with the private sector. The private sector in Ghana continues to borrow at about 25%, while their competitors elsewhere are borrowing at least 5%. One way to support them is to ensure a reasonable level of lending rates. Mr. Speaker, government is therefore working together with the banking community to launch a 2 billion credit and guarantee scheme in 2020. This initiative will be structured to incentivize banks to lend to the private sector at discounted lending rates. The scheme, which will start in the first quarter of 2020, will be targeted at specific industries such as agribusiness, manufacturing, hospitality, and tourism, and the tech sector, amongst others. I spoke to a very senior person when it comes to financial markets, and he says we still aren't fixing the problem with high. What are the other factors mitigating against high lending rates? And we've gone back and we're talking about credit guarantees and stuff like that. And he feels like this doesn't solve the problem. We should look at the credit reference bureau system and all other things that tend to eat into the lending rates. Will you agree or disagree with such assertions? I'll start with Anthony here.
Okay, thank you. I think when it comes to lending rates, particularly in Ghana, it's influenced by a number of factors. And typically in a commercial bank, one would say the lending rates will be influenced by the credit assessment and worthiness or the history of the borrower. But in Ghana, you also see that the cost of operations in terms of running a bank doesn't only come from the risk that they take on an individual, that is the potential to default, and therefore how do I build that into the pricing. They run on technology, and technology is not cheap in this country. Sometimes it's 4 times what you get compared to maybe a bank running in Europe. So they factor that in. Property that they have to run the banks do not come cheap. And then of course the other systems and people that they run. So when you put all these together, the variable sometimes, most of the time people are talking about the credit rate and credit reference. And if you solve it, the rest are not immediately solved. And therefore there's always that gap between what the lending rate is and even sometimes the macro indicators. For example, currently we have the policy rate trending downwards, the inflation trending downwards. One would expect that the interest rate will follow, but we don't see that significant direction of the interest rate, and because of these other components that really come in. So it will be good to have the reference rate, extremely good, because for individuals and people who are trustworthy, again, trust comes in. For borrowers who are trustworthy and will meet the repayment of their loans, then that history will be reflected in the fact that when I give a loan to this person, the person is likely to pay up. I won't incur the cost of credit, the cost of taking on this risk, and therefore the banks can look at it and be able to reduce the interest rate for it. So it's one of the good things to do. But as I said, it will not solve the entire problem. In the meantime, as you were trying to solve this problem, you cannot wait and leave the productive sector, the SMEs and all that to wait. And I think that is where the government intervention and policy to come in and say, let's provide a scheme that can provide some access to good ideas, good entrepreneurship. SMEs that sometimes people have started a business for 3-5 years. They are running with 10-20 people, but they've gotten to a point where they have to scale. But you'll be shy to go for a bank loan because you know you'll be wiped out. And therefore, such a scheme will provide intermediary for such institutions to run. But let me add, and from the experience and perspective of other countries, and also from the insights of other research that has been done by KPMG, these schemes will not succeed if certain factors are not taken into account. For instance, you have to run again on good conduct basis. That is, how do you select the people who must benefit? Between a person who is going to just start up, which typically one would say 70% will fail, and between the person who has done it 3 years, 5 years, you need to balance how much you give to those who are already in the business and those who are going to start up.
Okay.
Number two, you also then need to take account of the arrangement of the technical support that you give to such businesses, because at a point where you want to scale, you are talking about people, you are talking about processes, you are talking about system and market. And the financing alone will not solve the problem. So if you don't add the technical expertise to what you provide this credit to, then at the end of the day, the person may have the credit, will not be able to use it the way they have to use it, and then repayment becomes a problem. So in our history, that is some of the things that we experience. So I believe, and for that matter, KPMG believe that it is good to have the intervention, but it's also very, very important and
that
critical to ensure that the structures that will make it work so that we reach the proper target, the impact, the amount of size of loan that you give, and then the post-disbursement support are all there so that at the end of the day we can succeed in that perspective.
Seth, I'm sure you'll be happy with such a scheme for your industry. No?
Well, as long as it will bring cost of interest rates down, we will be happy with it. But it requires a lot of efforts and need the cooperation of the banks, because he's saying in the statement that to be with the cooperation of the banks. So we need to be sure that the banks will cooperate very well. One of the reasons why interest rate has always been high is what the bank side is, the high NPLs, the non-performing loans. How do you ensure that we reduce that so that we will not cite that as a reason again? And we are talking of guarantee schemes. Guarantee schemes are supposed to be much cheaper than actual cash that is advanced by a bank. So it means that we need to have different financing models to support businesses, and guarantee schemes could be one of them. But I don't think the laws of Bank of Ghana laws allow these things to operate very well, because normally when you give a guarantee, it's not cash. It's not even cash back guarantee. When you give a guarantee, the interest cost on it must be much lower. But in Ghana, when you are giving guarantees, you are also charging like the normal interest. So it doesn't make the guarantee schemes work very well. So we need to look at the laws that governs these guarantee schemes, and I think it's very important.
I think that's a good point. But we are unfortunately running low on time, so I'll take 30 seconds each from you. Wrap up for me quickly, and then the last question is the 2020 budget good for our pockets? Yes or no? First one, and then you'll wrap up in 30 seconds, please.
Okay. 2020 budget, I believe that it provides the opportunities for individuals and households to build up on their income. And if government is able to focus on those things and individuals takes advantage of what government will provide, I believe that it's going to be good for our pocket.
Seth?
For me, it is about the implementation. Good programs, good ideas, good initiatives. Let's see how well we implement them. If we implement them very well, and to the latter as has been projected, then we'll see it
be fine.
Reflected in our pockets.
Okay, this has been the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip Nanfuri. My guest, Anthony Sapon, Senior Partner, KPMG, and Setchuma Kwabwa, CEO, HEI. Have a good evening.
PM Express was brought to you